Remember when a homemade candy tray could stop an entire family in their tracks? Before supermarkets filled every shelf with packaged sweets, America's kitchens were famous for something far more special. Betty Crocker cookbooks inspired generations of home cooks to create unforgettable candies with nothing more than sugar, butter, chocolate, and a little patience. Some were whipped by hand, some boiled to the perfect temperature, and others took hours to finish, yet every single piece carried a story. Today, nearly all of those treasured recipes have disappeared from holiday tables and family recipe boxes. In this video, we're bringing back 30 forgotten Betty Crocker candies that once filled Christmas tins, church socials, and neighborhood gatherings, but have quietly faded into history. Along the way, you'll discover the fascinating stories behind these nostalgic treats, why families love them, and what caused them to vanish from American kitchens. Stay until the very end, because the final candies on our list are so rare that many younger Americans have never even heard their names. And while you're watching, let us know in the comments which one brings back your sweetest childhood memory. Coconut cream eggs. Long before chocolate eggs appeared on supermarket shelves every spring, many American families proudly made their own coconut cream eggs at home. Popularized through Betty Crocker cookbooks and treasured recipe collections of the 1950s and 1960s, these handmade candies were considered a true labor of love. They weren't reserved only for Easter. Families also prepared them for church socials, bridal showers, holiday dessert trays, and thoughtful homemade gifts because they looked elegant while costing very little to make. The filling began with shredded coconut, sweetened condensed milk, butter, vanilla, and powdered sugar mixed into a soft, creamy dough. After chilling, each piece was carefully shaped by hand into small egg-like forms before being dipped into rich melted chocolate. Grandmothers often lined them on sheets of wax paper, allowing the chocolate shell to harden into a glossy finish while the sweet coconut center stayed soft and chewy inside. The first bite delivered a satisfying crack from the chocolate coating, followed by the rich flavor of coconut, vanilla, and creamy sweetness that slowly melted in your mouth. Unlike factory-made candy, every homemade egg had its own unique shape, making each batch feel personal and handcrafted. As grocery stores filled with mass-produced holiday chocolates, fewer families found the time to make coconut cream eggs from scratch. Homemade candy traditions slowly disappeared, and recipes once carefully handwritten on aging recipe cards were tucked away in kitchen drawers, rarely opened again. Yet for many Americans, these simple chocolate-covered treats remain a powerful reminder of family kitchens, holiday afternoons, and generations gathered around the table. Perhaps that's why this forgotten Betty Crocker favorite still deserves a place among America's sweetest lost recipes. Which of these 30 forgotten candies would you love to taste again? Share your favorite in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to America's Lost Recipes for more delicious journeys into America's forgotten food history. Homemade lemon drops. Long before brightly colored sour candies filled convenience store shelves, homemade lemon drops were a treasured treat found in countless American kitchens. Betty Crocker recipes helped make these cheerful little candies a favorite throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Their bright citrus flavor offered a refreshing change from rich chocolates and buttery fudges, making them especially welcome after large family meals or during the winter months when fresh fruit was harder to find. Making lemon drops demanded careful attention. Sugar, light corn syrup, and water were gently boiled until they reached the hard crack stage. Only then were pure lemon extract, a touch of citric acid, and a few drops of yellow coloring stirred into the bubbling syrup. Working quickly, home cooks dropped small spoonfuls onto buttered baking sheets or wax paper, where each piece cooled into a glossy golden candy. Once hardened, the candies were lightly dusted with powdered sugar to keep them from sticking together inside glass jars. The first taste delivered a sharp burst of bright lemon followed by a pleasant sweetness that lingered long after the candy slowly dissolved. Unlike today's intensely flavored sour candies, these homemade treats balanced tartness and sweetness with a clean, natural citrus flavor that felt refreshing rather than overwhelming. As commercial candy factories introduced inexpensive packaged lemon candies, fewer families continued the careful process of boiling sugar and watching candy thermometers. Over time, homemade lemon drops quietly disappeared from kitchen counters, candy jars, and handwritten family recipe collections. Yet anyone who remembers slowly enjoying one of these golden candies also remembers the comforting warmth of a grandmother's kitchen and the simple joy hidden inside every handmade sweet. That's exactly why these forgotten lemon drops still deserve their place among America's most cherished lost recipes. Peanut clusters. Before candy aisles overflowed with factory-made chocolate treats, homemade peanut clusters were one of the easiest and most beloved candies found in American kitchens. Featured in Betty Crocker-inspired holiday collections and family recipe boxes throughout the 1950s and 1960s, these simple candies proved that unforgettable flavor didn't require complicated techniques or expensive ingredients. They were a favorite for Christmas tins, church bake sales, neighborhood gatherings, and thoughtful homemade gifts. The recipe was wonderfully straightforward. Milk or semi-sweet chocolate was slowly melted until smooth and glossy, then generously mixed with roasted peanuts. Some families preferred salted peanuts for a sweet and salty contrast, while others used unsalted peanuts to let the chocolate shine. Spoonfuls of the mixture were dropped onto sheets of wax paper, where they cooled into rustic clusters. No two pieces ever looked exactly alike, giving every batch a homemade charm that store-bought candy could never match. Each bite offered a satisfying crunch from the roasted peanuts wrapped in creamy chocolate. The rich cocoa flavor blended perfectly with the nutty texture, creating a candy that was both simple and deeply satisfying. Despite using only a handful of pantry ingredients, peanut clusters often disappeared from the candy tray before any other homemade treat. As candy companies began producing chocolate-covered nuts in large quantities, many families stopped making their own. Busy schedules and convenient packaged versions slowly replaced the tradition of gathering around the kitchen table to stir melted chocolate and create homemade clusters together. Today, peanut clusters remain a reminder that some of America's greatest recipes were also the simplest. They captured the warmth of family kitchens, the excitement of holiday baking, and the joy of sharing handmade treats with friends and neighbors. Sometimes, the sweetest memories were created with little more than chocolate, peanuts, and time spent together. Maple cream candy. Long before maple-flavored sweets became seasonal store displays, homemade maple cream candy was one of the most treasured treats in American kitchens. Betty Crocker cookbooks and community recipe collections helped introduce this elegant confection to families during the 1950s and 1960s, especially in the Northeast where pure maple syrup was a cherished local ingredient. Though it contained only a few simple components, making it successfully required patience, careful timing, and plenty of practice. Everything began with real maple syrup slowly simmered until it reached the perfect softball stage. After cooling slightly, the syrup was beaten by hand with a sturdy wooden spoon until it transformed from a clear amber liquid into a thick, creamy mixture with a pale golden color. Home cooks had to work quickly before it hardened, pressing the mixture into small candy molds shaped like maple leaves, flowers, or tiny hearts. Once set, the candies slipped easily from their molds, revealing beautiful details that looked almost too pretty to eat. The first bite was unlike ordinary sugar candy. Instead of overwhelming sweetness, maple cream candy offered a rich, buttery maple flavor that slowly melted across the tongue. Its smooth, velvety texture dissolved almost instantly, leaving behind the unmistakable taste of pure maple syrup without any artificial flavoring. As genuine maple syrup became more expensive and convenience foods dominated grocery stores, fewer families were willing to spend time making these delicate candies by hand. Plastic-wrapped sweets gradually replaced homemade batches, and the wooden molds that once appeared every holiday season were tucked away in kitchen drawers. Today, maple cream candy remains a symbol of an era when simple ingredients, careful craftsmanship, and family traditions mattered more than convenience. Every small maple leaf carried the flavor of autumn, the warmth of home, and a sweet reminder of America's forgotten candy-making heritage. English toffee bars. Long before premium chocolate bars lined grocery store shelves, English toffee bars were a homemade favorite that appeared in countless American kitchens. Betty Crocker recipes helped make this buttery candy popular throughout the 1950s and 1960s, especially during Christmas when families filled decorative tins with handmade sweets. Despite their elegant appearance, these bars were surprisingly affordable, relying on pantry staples that nearly every home cook already had on hand. The recipe started with butter and brown sugar gently cooked together until they formed a rich, golden toffee. Crushed graham cracker crumbs were often stirred into the mixture, creating a sturdy base that added both texture and flavor. After being spread into a baking pan, the toffee baked until bubbling and fragrant. While it was still warm, generous handfuls of chocolate chips were scattered across the surface. As the chocolate softened, it was carefully spread into a smooth layer, sometimes finished with chopped pecans or walnuts for extra crunch. Once completely cooled, the candy was cut into neat bars or broken into rustic pieces. Every bite offered a delightful contrast of textures. The crisp, buttery toffee snapped gently beneath your teeth, while the creamy chocolate melted smoothly, creating a rich combination that felt both comforting and indulgent. The graham cracker layer added a subtle sweetness that balanced the deep caramel flavor perfectly. As supermarkets introduced factory-made candy bars and boxed holiday chocolates, fewer families continued baking English toffee bars at home. The tradition slowly faded, replaced by convenient packaged desserts that lacked the unmistakable taste of fresh butter and homemade craftsmanship. Even today, English toffee bars remind many Americans of holiday kitchens filled with the aroma of caramelizing sugar, warm chocolate, and laughter shared around the table. They remain a delicious symbol of a time when homemade treats carried far more meaning than anything wrapped in shiny foil. Homemade peppermint patties. Long before colorful packages of peppermint patties filled checkout aisles, American families proudly made their own at home. Betty Crocker cookbooks and holiday recipe collections helped popularize these refreshing treats throughout the 1950s and 1960s, when homemade candy was considered a thoughtful gift rather than a weekend project. Their cool flavor made them especially popular after large holiday dinners, offering a refreshing finish to rich meals. The process began by blending powdered sugar, butter, sweetened condensed milk, and pure peppermint extract into a smooth, creamy dough. Once chilled, the mixture was rolled out and cut into neat circles using a biscuit cutter or even the rim of a drinking glass. Each peppermint disc was carefully dipped into warm melted dark chocolate with a fork, allowing the excess coating to drip away before resting on wax paper to harden. As the chocolate cooled, it formed a glossy shell that perfectly sealed the soft peppermint center inside. The first bite delivered a satisfying snap from the thin chocolate coating before giving way to a cool, creamy filling that slowly melted across the tongue. The rich dark chocolate balanced the refreshing peppermint beautifully, creating a candy that felt elegant without being overly sweet. Unlike many modern versions, homemade patties had a fresh, natural mint flavor that lingered pleasantly long after the last bite. As commercial candy companies began producing peppermint patties by the millions, fewer families continued making them from scratch. Convenience slowly replaced tradition, and the familiar sight of wax paper lined with freshly dipped candies became increasingly rare. Today, homemade peppermint patties remain a delicious reminder of an era when patience and simple ingredients created unforgettable treats. Their cool flavor, handcrafted appearance, and timeless charm continue to capture the warmth of holiday kitchens and the joy of sharing homemade sweets with family and friends across generations. Vanilla caramels. Long before individually wrapped caramel candies filled supermarket shelves, homemade vanilla caramels were a treasured tradition in American kitchens. Betty Crocker recipes helped make these buttery confections a holiday favorite throughout the 1950s and 1960s, when families proudly prepared large batches to share with neighbors, church friends, and visiting relatives. Wrapped by hand in squares of wax paper, they were often tucked into festive cookie tins alongside fudge, peanut brittle, and other homemade sweets. Making vanilla caramels required patience and careful attention. Butter, heavy cream, sugar, light corn syrup, and a splash of pure vanilla were slowly cooked together until the mixture reached the perfect firm ball stage. The bubbling caramel had to be stirred constantly to prevent scorching while developing its rich golden color. Once ready, it was poured into a buttered pan and left to cool completely before being cut into neat rectangles. Every piece was then individually wrapped in wax paper with twisted ends, making each candy look like a tiny handmade gift. The reward was unforgettable. Every bite offered a soft, chewy texture that slowly melted into rich notes of butter, fresh cream, and warm vanilla. Unlike many commercial caramels, homemade versions tasted smoother, creamier, and carried a depth of flavor that only slow cooking could create. Their gentle sweetness made them a favorite for both children and adults during the holiday season. As factory-made candies became cheaper and easier to buy, the tradition of standing over the stove for nearly an hour slowly faded away. Homemade vanilla caramels gradually disappeared from family kitchens, replaced by plastic bags of mass-produced sweets that lacked the same rich homemade character. Even today, these buttery little candies remind many Americans of holiday afternoons spent wrapping warm caramels together, proving that the sweetest family memories were often created one piece at a time. Chocolate truffles. Long before gourmet chocolate boutiques appeared in every shopping mall, homemade chocolate truffles were considered one of the most elegant candies a home cook could serve. Betty Crocker cookbooks and entertaining guides introduced these rich confections to American families during the 1950s and 1960s, when special occasions often called for homemade sweets that looked as impressive as they tasted. Whether arranged on holiday dessert trays or presented in decorative gift boxes, chocolate truffles were a symbol of patience, skill, and hospitality. The process began by gently heating heavy cream until it was just hot enough to melt chopped dark chocolate into a silky ganache. After a splash of vanilla was added, the mixture was chilled until firm enough to shape by hand. Using a small spoon, home cooks rolled each portion into a smooth ball before coating it in finely chopped pecans, walnuts, almonds, or a dusting of cocoa powder. Because every truffle was shaped individually, no two pieces ever looked exactly alike, giving each batch a distinctive homemade character. The first bite was wonderfully rich. The delicate coating gave way to a smooth, velvety center that melted slowly across the tongue, releasing deep chocolate flavor balanced by the gentle crunch of toasted nuts. Unlike many modern truffles filled with artificial flavors, these homemade versions celebrated the pure taste of quality chocolate, making every piece feel truly special. As boxed chocolates became widely available and gourmet candy shops grew more popular, fewer families invested the time needed to prepare chocolate truffles from scratch. The tradition gradually faded, replaced by convenient store-bought assortments that lacked the warmth of handmade treats. Today, chocolate truffles remain a timeless reminder of an era when homemade candy reflected genuine care and craftsmanship. Their rich flavor, elegant appearance, and handcrafted charm continue to represent the very best of America's forgotten candy-making traditions, proving that simple ingredients could create unforgettable memories. Bourbon balls. Long before gourmet liquor-filled chocolates became a holiday luxury, homemade bourbon balls were a cherished tradition in many American homes. Featured in Betty Crocker holiday recipe collections and community cookbooks throughout the 1950s and 1960s, these rich no-bake candies were prepared especially for Christmas gatherings, cocktail parties, and festive celebrations. Reserved for adults, they were known for their bold flavor and elegant appearance, making them one of the most memorable treats on any holiday candy tray. The recipe combined crushed vanilla wafers, finely chopped pecans, cocoa powder, powdered sugar, light corn syrup, and a generous splash of quality bourbon. Everything was mixed together until it formed a soft, rich dough that was rolled into bite-sized balls by hand. Some families coated them in powdered sugar, while others preferred chopped pecans or cocoa powder for a more sophisticated finish. Afterward, the candies were stored in tightly sealed tins for several days, allowing the bourbon to mellow and the flavors to blend into something truly remarkable. Each bite delivered a deep chocolate flavor followed by warm notes of vanilla, toasted pecans, and smooth bourbon. The texture was soft and slightly crumbly, melting gently on the tongue while leaving behind a rich, lingering finish. Unlike modern liquor-filled chocolates, homemade bourbon balls offered a balanced flavor where every ingredient complemented the others without overpowering the candy. As ready-made desserts and boxed chocolates became more common, fewer families continued making bourbon balls from scratch. Changing tastes and busy lifestyles gradually pushed this classic recipe aside, and many younger generations never experienced the tradition of preparing them at home. Today, bourbon balls remain a delicious reminder of America's homemade holiday traditions. They represent a time when special occasions were celebrated with handcrafted treats, shared among family and friends, and made with patience, pride, and recipes lovingly passed from one generation to the next. Peanut butter pinwheels. Long before peanut butter cups became one of America's favorite candies, homemade peanut butter pinwheels were a delightful treat that decorated countless holiday trays. Betty Crocker recipes and community cookbooks helped make these colorful spiral candies popular throughout the 1950s and 1960s, when homemade sweets were often displayed as proudly as the holiday meal itself. Their beautiful swirled pattern made them look complicated, yet they were created with simple pantry ingredients and plenty of patience. The candy began with two separate mixtures. One was a smooth vanilla fondant made from powdered sugar, butter, and a little cream, while the other combined creamy peanut butter with powdered sugar and butter into a rich filling. The vanilla layer was carefully rolled out on wax paper before the peanut butter mixture was spread evenly across the surface. With steady hands, the entire sheet was rolled into a tight log, wrapped, and chilled overnight. The following day, it was sliced into delicate rounds, revealing perfect golden and white spirals that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Each bite delivered a creamy blend of sweet vanilla and roasted peanut butter. The soft texture melted gently on the tongue, while the peanut butter added a subtle salty richness that balanced the sweetness. Unlike modern candy bars filled with preservatives, these homemade pinwheels tasted fresh, smooth, and wonderfully comforting. As factory-made peanut butter candies became cheaper and easier to buy, the tradition of making peanut butter pinwheels slowly disappeared. Families no longer gathered around kitchen tables to roll, chill, and slice these elegant treats, and one more handcrafted recipe quietly faded into history. Today, peanut butter pinwheels remain a reminder of a time when presentation mattered just as much as flavor. Their beautiful spiral design, rich homemade taste, and nostalgic charm continue to represent the creativity and care that once defined America's forgotten candy-making traditions. Almond toffee. Long before premium chocolate-covered toffee became a specialty store favorite, homemade almond toffee was one of the most prized candies in American kitchens. Betty Crocker recipes and holiday baking guides helped make this buttery confection a tradition throughout the 1950s and 1960s. It regularly appeared in Christmas gift tins, church bake sales, and family celebrations because it looked elegant, tasted luxurious, and could be made with a handful of pantry staples and plenty of patience. Preparing almond toffee required careful timing. Butter and sugar were slowly cooked together until they reached the hard crack stage, creating a deep golden caramel with a rich, nutty aroma. Chopped toasted almonds were stirred into the bubbling mixture before it was poured onto a buttered baking sheet and spread into a thin layer. While the candy was still warm, melted chocolate was evenly spread across the surface and sprinkled with more chopped almonds. Once completely cooled, the brittle sheet was broken into rustic pieces, each one shimmering with glossy chocolate and crunchy toasted nuts. The first bite delivered a satisfying snap, followed by layers of buttery caramel, roasted almonds, and silky chocolate. The rich toffee slowly melted while the toasted almonds added a delicate crunch that balanced every mouthful. Unlike many modern versions made with artificial flavorings, homemade almond toffee celebrated the natural richness of butter and freshly roasted nuts. As store-bought candy became more convenient, fewer families devoted the time needed to cook sugar with such precision. Homemade almond toffee gradually disappeared from holiday traditions, replaced by factory-produced sweets that rarely matched its fresh flavor or handcrafted charm. Today, almond toffee remains a delicious reminder of an era when homemade candy reflected patience, skill, and generosity. Every crisp, chocolate-covered piece captured the warmth of family kitchens and the timeless joy of sharing something made entirely by hand with the people you loved most. Chocolate turtle candies. Long before boxed chocolates filled every supermarket aisle, homemade chocolate turtle candies were one of the most admired treats on American dessert tables. Betty Crocker holiday recipes and family cookbooks helped make these elegant candies a favorite throughout the 1950s and 1960s. They earned their playful name because the pecans sticking out beneath the caramel resembled a turtle's tiny legs. Whether served at Christmas gatherings, church socials, or packed into homemade gift boxes, these candies always disappeared quickly. The recipe began by arranging toasted pecan halves into small clusters on sheets of wax paper. A spoonful of warm homemade caramel was carefully placed over each cluster, allowing it to settle between the nuts without completely covering them. Once the caramel cooled slightly, each piece was coated with silky melted chocolate until the caramel was hidden beneath a smooth, glossy shell. After resting at room temperature, the chocolate hardened into a beautiful finish while the caramel remained deliciously soft and chewy inside. The first bite revealed why these candies became so beloved. The crisp chocolate coating gave way to buttery caramel that slowly stretched with every bite, while the toasted pecans added a rich, nutty crunch. The combination of creamy chocolate, smooth caramel, and roasted pecans created a perfectly balanced candy that felt both comforting and luxurious. As commercial candy companies introduced mass-produced turtle candies, many families gradually stopped making them from scratch. Busy schedules replaced slow afternoons in the kitchen, and handmade batches became less common with every passing decade. Today, chocolate turtle candies remain a treasured reminder of a time when homemade sweets reflected patience, generosity, and pride. Every handcrafted piece carried the warmth of family traditions and holiday celebrations, proving that the most unforgettable candies were often the ones lovingly created at home rather than purchased from a store shelf. Candied ginger. Long before ginger became a trendy ingredient in health foods and specialty drinks, homemade candied ginger was a respected treat in American kitchens. Betty Crocker cookbooks and vintage household recipe collections introduced this unique candy to home cooks during the 1950s and 1960s. Unlike rich chocolates or creamy fudges, candied ginger offered a bold, spicy flavor that many families enjoyed after hearty meals. It was often served during the holidays, packed into homemade candy tins, or offered to guests as a refreshing palate cleanser. Making candied ginger was a slow and careful process. Fresh ginger roots were peeled and sliced into thin pieces before being simmered several times to soften their natural sharpness. The slices were then cooked in a rich sugar syrup until they became glossy, translucent, and wonderfully tender. After drying overnight on cooling racks, each piece was generously coated in sparkling granulated sugar, creating a beautiful crystal-like finish that made the candy as attractive as it was delicious. The first bite offered an experience unlike any other homemade sweet. The sugary coating dissolved quickly, revealing the warm, peppery flavor of ginger beneath. Sweetness arrived first, followed by a gentle spicy kick that slowly spread across the tongue without overwhelming the palate. Its chewy texture made every piece last a little longer, encouraging people to savor rather than rush each bite. As chocolate bars and brightly colored candies became more popular, homemade candied ginger quietly disappeared from many American kitchens. Younger generations often preferred sweeter treats, leaving this centuries-old recipe tucked away inside forgotten cookbooks and family recipe boxes. Today, candied ginger stands as a reminder that America's candy traditions once celebrated bold flavors alongside sweetness. Its handcrafted simplicity, natural ingredients, and unforgettable warmth continue to reflect a time when homemade treats offered comfort, character, and a connection to generations of skilled home cooks. Marshmallow swirl fudge. Long before colorful fudge varieties filled bakery display cases, homemade marshmallow swirl fudge was one of the most eye-catching treats found in American kitchens. Betty Crocker recipes and holiday cookbooks helped popularize this beautiful candy during the 1950s and 1960s, when homemade dessert trays were expected to be just as impressive as the family feast itself. With its striking swirls of chocolate and creamy vanilla, this fudge quickly became a favorite at Christmas parties, church socials, and neighborhood cookie exchanges. Creating it required both timing and a steady hand. Home cooks first prepared a rich chocolate fudge using sugar, butter, milk, and cocoa, cooking the mixture until it reached the perfect consistency. A second batch was made with marshmallow cream and vanilla, creating a smooth white fudge. Before either layer had time to set, both mixtures were poured into a buttered pan. Using the tip of a knife, gentle swirls were drawn through the candy, creating elegant marbled patterns that made every batch completely unique. After cooling for several hours, the fudge was cut into neat squares and carefully arranged on serving trays or packed into holiday gift tins. Each bite combined two classic flavors in perfect harmony. The deep richness of chocolate blended beautifully with the light, creamy sweetness of marshmallow, creating a smooth texture that melted slowly on the tongue. Every square looked like a tiny work of edible art, making it almost as enjoyable to admire as it was to eat. As commercial fudge shops became more common and ready-made desserts replaced homemade candy, marshmallow swirl fudge gradually disappeared from many family kitchens. The careful art of creating perfect swirls became another forgotten skill. Today, this beautiful candy remains a delicious reminder of an era when homemade desserts were crafted with patience, creativity, and pride, turning simple ingredients into unforgettable family traditions. Date nut roll. Long before packaged fruit and nut snacks became a grocery store staple, homemade date nut roll was one of America's most treasured old-fashioned candies. Betty Crocker cookbooks and community recipe collections helped make this sweet confection a favorite during the 1950s and 1960s. It often appeared on holiday dessert trays, church suppers, and family gatherings because it looked elegant, required only simple pantry ingredients, and could be prepared well in advance of special occasions. The recipe began with chopped dates gently cooked together with sugar, butter, and miniature marshmallows until everything melted into a thick, sticky mixture. Once smooth, generous handfuls of chopped walnuts or pecans were folded in, adding both flavor and texture. While still warm, the mixture was rolled into a neat log on a sheet of wax paper, then wrapped tightly and chilled overnight. The next day, it was sliced into thin rounds, revealing beautiful specks of fruit and toasted nuts in every piece. The first bite delivered a wonderfully chewy texture followed by the natural caramel-like sweetness of dates. Crunchy walnuts balanced the soft filling, while the marshmallows created a creamy richness that tied every flavor together. Unlike many modern candies loaded with artificial ingredients, date nut roll offered a wholesome sweetness that felt both satisfying and comforting. As convenience foods became increasingly popular, fewer families kept dates stocked in their kitchen pantries. Homemade candies slowly gave way to factory-made snacks, and this once-beloved recipe quietly disappeared from many holiday traditions. Younger generations often never had the chance to discover its rich flavor or simple homemade charm. Today, date nut roll remains a delicious reminder of a time when America's favorite candies were handcrafted with patience and care. Every slice reflected the creativity of home cooks who transformed everyday ingredients into something memorable, proving that the sweetest traditions were often the simplest ones shared around the family table. Popcorn balls. Long before bags of caramel popcorn and packaged snack mixes filled supermarket shelves, homemade popcorn balls were one of America's most beloved sweet treats. Betty Crocker cookbooks and family recipe collections helped make them a holiday tradition throughout the 1950s and 1960s. They were especially popular during Halloween, Christmas, harvest festivals, and school parties, where children eagerly reached for these colorful, hand-shaped treats. Affordable to make and fun to prepare, popcorn balls became a symbol of family gatherings and old-fashioned celebrations. The recipe began with freshly popped popcorn, carefully sorted to remove every unpopped kernel. Meanwhile, butter, sugar, light corn syrup, and a splash of vanilla were gently cooked into a glossy syrup. Some families added a few drops of red or green food coloring for festive occasions, while others mixed in cinnamon candies, peanuts, or miniature marshmallows for extra flavor. The warm syrup was poured over the popcorn, and with buttered hands, each sticky handful was quickly shaped into a firm, round ball before the coating cooled and hardened. Every bite delivered a delightful combination of light, crispy popcorn and rich caramel sweetness. The crunchy texture gave way to buttery flavor with hints of vanilla, making each popcorn ball both satisfying and surprisingly light. Unlike many modern snacks, every homemade batch had its own unique appearance, reflecting the care and creativity of the person who made it. As individually wrapped candy bars and packaged popcorn became easier to buy, the tradition of making popcorn balls slowly faded from American kitchens. Family gatherings became busier, and fewer children experienced the excitement of helping shape warm popcorn into perfect spheres. Today, popcorn balls remain a nostalgic reminder of simpler celebrations, neighborhood parties, and homemade traditions. They prove that a handful of popcorn, a little caramel, and time spent together could create memories that lasted far longer than the candy itself. Part 14. Southern Pralines. Long before candy stores displayed rows of gourmet chocolates, homemade Southern pralines were one of America's most treasured old-fashioned confections. Betty Crocker cookbooks and Southern family recipe collections helped introduce these buttery candies to home kitchens across the country during the 1950s and 1960s. Deeply rooted in Southern tradition, pralines became a favorite at holiday gatherings, church socials, and family reunions, where a fresh batch was often considered a special sign of hospitality and pride. Making pralines required careful attention from start to finish. Butter, brown sugar, white sugar, heavy cream, and a touch of vanilla were slowly cooked together until the mixture reached the perfect softball stage. At just the right moment, generous handfuls of toasted pecans were stirred into the bubbling candy. Working quickly before it hardened, home cooks dropped spoonfuls onto sheets of wax paper, where each candy spread into its own unique shape. As they cooled, the glossy surface transformed into a delicate, creamy finish with pecans peeking through every bite. The flavor was unforgettable. Each praline offered a smooth, melt-in-your-mouth texture followed by the rich taste of buttery caramel and roasted pecans. Unlike brittle candies that snapped apart, pralines were soft, creamy, and wonderfully rich, creating a comforting sweetness that lingered long after the last bite. Every homemade batch had slight differences, making each piece feel truly one of a kind. As mass-produced chocolates and packaged candies became more common, fewer families continued making pralines from scratch. The careful timing, constant stirring, and attention they required gradually gave way to quicker desserts and store-bought treats. Today, Southern pralines remain a delicious reminder of America's rich candy-making heritage. They capture the warmth of Southern hospitality, the joy of homemade traditions, and the timeless belief that the finest sweets were crafted with patience, simple ingredients, and love shared around the family table. Chocolate-dipped Ritz crackers. Long before gourmet chocolate-covered snacks became a specialty store trend, chocolate-dipped Ritz crackers were a surprisingly elegant homemade candy found in many American kitchens. Betty Crocker holiday recipe collections and family cookbooks helped popularize this clever treat throughout the 1950s and 1960s. While the ingredients were simple and inexpensive, the finished candies looked impressive enough to earn a place on Christmas dessert trays, church bake sales, and homemade gift boxes shared with friends and neighbors. The recipe was wonderfully straightforward. Crisp Ritz crackers were spread with a layer of creamy peanut butter or smooth caramel before another cracker was placed on top to create a small sandwich. Each one was then carefully dipped into warm melted milk or semi-sweet chocolate, making sure every edge was completely coated. Some home cooks decorated the tops with finely chopped pecans, colorful sprinkles, or a delicate drizzle of white chocolate before placing them on wax paper to cool. Once the chocolate hardened, the humble crackers had been transformed into beautiful bite-sized candies. The first bite offered an unforgettable surprise. The crisp, buttery cracker contrasted perfectly with the silky chocolate coating, while the creamy peanut butter or soft caramel filling added richness and depth. The slight saltiness of the cracker balanced the sweetness beautifully, creating a flavor combination that felt both comforting and irresistible. It was a simple recipe that tasted far more luxurious than anyone expected. As candy manufacturers introduced countless packaged chocolate treats, fewer families continued making chocolate-dipped Ritz crackers by hand. Convenience slowly replaced creativity, and this clever homemade favorite quietly disappeared from many holiday traditions. Today, these nostalgic candies remind us that some of America's most memorable sweets weren't created in candy factories at all. They were born in family kitchens, where ordinary pantry ingredients became extraordinary treats through imagination, patience, and the joy of sharing something homemade with the people who mattered most. Seafoam candy. Long before airy chocolate bars and whipped candy became common in supermarkets, homemade seafoam candy was one of America's most fascinating old-fashioned confections. Betty Crocker cookbooks and family recipe collections introduced this light, honeycombed candy to countless kitchens during the 1950s and 1960s. Its delicate texture and dramatic transformation made it a favorite for holiday candy trays, church fairs, and homemade Christmas gifts. Watching it rise into a bubbly golden foam was almost as exciting as eating it. Making seafoam candy required confidence and perfect timing. Sugar, light corn syrup, and water were cooked together until they reached the hard crack stage. At the last possible moment, baking soda was stirred into the hot syrup. Almost instantly, the mixture expanded into a thick, airy foam filled with thousands of tiny bubbles. Without stirring further, home cooks quickly poured it into a buttered pan to cool. Once hardened, the candy was broken into irregular golden pieces, and many families dipped one side in melted chocolate for an extra layer of richness. The first bite was unlike any ordinary candy. Instead of being hard and dense, seafoam candy shattered into a crisp, delicate crunch before melting almost instantly on the tongue. Its sweet caramel flavor blended beautifully with the light, airy texture, while the optional chocolate coating added a smooth finish that made every bite even more satisfying. As commercial candy factories perfected mass-produced chocolate bars and packaged sweets, fewer families attempted the careful process of making seafoam candy at home. Its dramatic preparation gradually became a forgotten kitchen skill, remembered mostly through aging recipe cards and treasured family traditions. Today, seafoam candy remains a remarkable reminder of America's homemade candy-making heritage. Its airy texture, golden appearance, and unforgettable crunch continue to celebrate a time when simple ingredients, careful timing, and a little kitchen magic created sweets that families remembered for generations. Buttermints. Long before colorful mint candies filled restaurant counters and wedding reception tables, homemade buttermints were a treasured favorite in American homes. Betty Crocker cookbooks and community recipe collections helped make these delicate little candies popular throughout the 1950s and 1960s. They were a familiar sight at baby showers, bridal teas, church socials, holiday gatherings, and Sunday dinners. Their soft texture, refreshing flavor, and elegant appearance made them feel special, even though they were made from just a handful of everyday ingredients. Preparing buttermints was surprisingly simple but required patience. Butter, powdered sugar, a small amount of buttermilk, and pure peppermint extract were blended into a smooth, silky dough. Some home cooks added a drop of pastel food coloring, creating soft shades of pink, green, or yellow for festive occasions. The dough was rolled into thin ropes, pressed into decorative molds, or cut into tiny pillow-shaped pieces before being left to dry for several hours. As they rested, the candies developed a delicate outer shell while remaining wonderfully creamy inside. The first bite was gentle and refreshing. The thin outer layer dissolved almost instantly, giving way to a smooth, buttery center with a cool peppermint flavor that slowly melted across the tongue. Unlike today's intensely flavored mint candies, homemade buttermints offered a mild sweetness balanced by rich butter and a clean, natural mint taste that never overwhelmed the palate. As packaged breath mints and commercially produced peppermint candies became increasingly popular, the tradition of making buttermints at home gradually faded away. Decorative candy molds disappeared from kitchen drawers, and many family recipes were quietly forgotten over time. Today, buttermints remain a charming reminder of an era when homemade candies added elegance to every celebration. Their delicate texture, refreshing flavor, and handcrafted beauty continue to reflect the warmth of family gatherings and the timeless traditions that once made America's sweetest occasions unforgettable. Cherry cordials. Long before boxed chocolate assortments became a holiday tradition, homemade cherry cordials were among the most elegant candies found in American kitchens. Betty Crocker cookbooks and holiday recipe collections helped introduce these beautiful treats to home cooks during the 1950s and 1960s. They were often reserved for Christmas celebrations, wedding receptions, and special family gatherings because they looked like candies from an expensive chocolate shop, yet they could be made right at home with a little patience and care. The recipe began with bright maraschino cherries that were carefully drained and dried to remove excess moisture. Each cherry was wrapped in a soft vanilla fondant made from powdered sugar, butter, and a touch of cream. After resting overnight, the fondant gradually softened around the fruit, creating a smooth, creamy center. The cherries were then dipped into rich melted chocolate and placed on wax paper to harden. Within a few days, something remarkable happened. The fondant slowly transformed into a silky liquid surrounding the cherry, giving each candy its signature creamy filling. The first bite offered a satisfying crack from the chocolate shell before revealing the sweet cherry and its luscious liquid center. The rich chocolate balanced the bright fruit flavor perfectly, creating a candy that felt both refreshing and indulgent. Every piece delivered the same delightful surprise, making cherry cordials one of the most anticipated treats on any holiday candy tray. As commercial candy companies began producing chocolate-covered cherries in enormous quantities, fewer families continued making them by hand. The careful process required time and planning, and convenience eventually replaced tradition in many homes. Today, homemade cherry cordials remain a symbol of old-fashioned craftsmanship and holiday generosity. They remind us of a time when creating beautiful candies from scratch was an expression of love, patience, and pride, leaving behind sweet memories that lasted long after the last chocolate had disappeared. Rum balls. Long before elegant dessert tables featured imported chocolates and gourmet truffles, homemade rum balls were a cherished holiday candy in many American homes. Betty Crocker holiday cookbooks and entertaining guides helped popularize these rich no-bake treats throughout the 1950s and 1960s. They became a favorite at Christmas parties, New Year's celebrations, and festive gatherings because they were easy to prepare, looked sophisticated, and developed even better flavor after a few days of resting. For many adults, no holiday candy tray felt complete without them. The recipe combined crushed vanilla wafers or chocolate cookie crumbs with finely chopped walnuts or pecans, cocoa powder, powdered sugar, and a generous splash of dark rum. A little light corn syrup helped bind everything into a smooth, rich mixture. Once thoroughly mixed, the dough was rolled into small bite-sized balls by hand. Each candy was then coated in powdered sugar, finely chopped nuts, chocolate sprinkles, or unsweetened cocoa powder before being stored in airtight tins. After several days, the rum mellowed and blended beautifully with the other ingredients, creating an even richer flavor. The first bite was soft, smooth, and deeply satisfying. Rich chocolate and toasted nuts were followed by the warm, aromatic notes of rum that lingered pleasantly without overpowering the candy. Unlike many modern sweets that relied on artificial flavors, homemade rum balls offered a balanced taste that felt both comforting and refined. Their tender texture made them almost melt in your mouth, leaving behind a wonderfully rich finish. As store-bought holiday desserts became more convenient, fewer families continued making rum balls from scratch. Recipes that had once been passed from one generation to the next slowly disappeared from holiday traditions. Today, rum balls remain a delicious reminder of an era when homemade candies brought families together, celebrated special occasions, and transformed simple pantry ingredients into unforgettable treats that were shared with pride year after year. Candied orange peel. Long before chocolate-covered orange slices and citrus-flavored candies became specialty store treats, homemade candied orange peel was a cherished recipe in American kitchens. Betty Crocker cookbooks and holiday recipe collections introduced this bright, fragrant confection to countless families during the 1950s and 1960s. Instead of throwing away orange peels after breakfast or holiday baking, resourceful home cooks transformed them into elegant candies that often appeared on Christmas dessert trays, afternoon tea tables, and homemade gift baskets. The process required time but very little waste. Fresh orange peels were carefully sliced into thin strips and simmered several times in water to soften their texture and reduce bitterness. They were then gently cooked in a rich sugar syrup until the peels became glossy, tender, and almost translucent. After drying overnight on wire racks, each strip was rolled in sparkling granulated sugar. Some families added one final touch by dipping half of each candied peel into melted dark chocolate, creating a beautiful contrast of bright citrus and rich cocoa. The first bite offered a delightful balance of flavors. The crisp sugar coating gave way to a pleasantly chewy center bursting with natural orange oils and gentle sweetness. The citrus flavor was bright and refreshing without being overpowering, while the chocolate-dipped version added a smooth richness that complemented the fruit perfectly. Every piece felt elegant despite being made from something that would normally be discarded. As packaged fruit candies and factory-made chocolates became more common, the tradition of making candied orange peel slowly faded from American kitchens. Convenience replaced creativity, and many younger generations never discovered how ordinary orange peels could become such remarkable homemade treats. Today, Candied orange peel remains a beautiful reminder of a time when thrift, patience, and imagination shaped America's sweetest traditions. It proves that even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into unforgettable candies that brought families together and added a touch of homemade elegance to every celebration. Peppermint bark. Long before gourmet chocolate shops turned peppermint bark into a seasonal luxury, homemade versions were a beloved holiday tradition in American kitchens. Betty Crocker cookbooks and Christmas recipe collections helped popularize this festive candy throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Its striking layers of creamy white and rich dark chocolate, topped with crushed peppermint candy, made it one of the most beautiful treats on holiday dessert trays. Families loved it because it looked elegant, tasted refreshing, and required only a handful of simple ingredients. The recipe began by melting semi-sweet chocolate until perfectly smooth before spreading it into a thin, even layer on a parchment-lined baking pan. Once the chocolate had partially set, a layer of melted white chocolate was carefully poured over the top. Before either layer hardened completely, generous handfuls of crushed peppermint candies or candy canes were sprinkled across the surface, adding a festive sparkle and satisfying crunch. After chilling for several hours, the bark was broken into irregular pieces, ensuring every shard looked unique and handmade. The first bite offered a delightful contrast of flavors and textures. The rich chocolate melted slowly while the crisp peppermint pieces delivered a cool burst of mint with every crunch. The creamy sweetness of the white chocolate balanced the deeper cocoa flavor perfectly, creating a candy that felt both refreshing and indulgent. Every broken piece looked like a tiny winter masterpiece, making it just as enjoyable to serve as it was to eat. As ready-made holiday candies became widely available, fewer families gathered in the kitchen to make peppermint bark from scratch. Beautiful homemade trays slowly gave way to store-bought gift boxes, and another cherished tradition quietly began to disappear. Today, peppermint bark remains a timeless reminder of holiday afternoons filled with laughter, melted chocolate, and the joyful excitement of creating homemade treats together. Its crisp peppermint flavor and handcrafted charm continue to capture the magic of America's sweetest Christmas traditions. Molasses taffy. Long before colorful bags of chewy candy lined convenience store shelves, homemade molasses taffy was a favorite treat in American kitchens. Betty Crocker cookbooks and family recipe collections helped keep this old-fashioned candy alive throughout the 1950s and 1960s, although its roots stretched back much further. Families especially enjoyed making it during the cooler months, when everyone could gather around the kitchen to help pull and stretch the warm candy. It wasn't just a dessert, it was a tradition that turned candy making into a family event. The recipe began by slowly boiling molasses, sugar, butter, vinegar, and a pinch of salt until the mixture reached the hardball stage. Once poured onto a buttered marble slab or baking sheet, the candy was allowed to cool just enough to handle. Then came the most memorable step. Family members buttered their hands and pulled the taffy over and over again, folding and stretching it repeatedly until its dark brown color changed into a lighter golden shade. This process filled the candy with tiny air bubbles, giving it a softer texture and glossy appearance. Finally, the long ropes were cut into bite-sized pieces and wrapped in squares of wax paper. The first bite was wonderfully chewy, with deep caramel notes from the molasses balanced by the richness of butter. Unlike modern fruit-flavored taffies, molasses taffy offered a warm, old-fashioned sweetness with hints of toffee and brown sugar that lingered pleasantly after every bite. As commercially produced candies became cheaper and easier to find, families gradually stopped gathering to pull taffy by hand. The tradition slowly disappeared, taking with it one of the most interactive candy-making experiences American kitchens had ever known. Today, molasses taffy remains a sweet reminder that some of the best family memories weren't just made by eating homemade candy, they were created while making it together. Coconut bonbons. Long before colorful candy assortments filled supermarket shelves, homemade coconut bonbons were among the most cherished treats in American kitchens. Betty Crocker cookbooks and holiday recipe collections helped make these bite-sized delights a favorite throughout the 1950s and 1960s. They regularly appeared on Christmas dessert trays, church socials, bridal showers, and neighborhood gatherings because they looked elegant, traveled well, and could be made with simple pantry ingredients. For many families, no holiday candy tin felt complete without a row of homemade coconut bonbons. The recipe began by combining shredded coconut with sweetened condensed milk, powdered sugar, butter, and a splash of vanilla until the mixture formed a soft, creamy dough. Small portions were rolled by hand into smooth balls, and some home cooks tucked a whole almond or maraschino cherry into the center for an unexpected surprise. After chilling until firm, each bonbon was carefully dipped into melted milk or dark chocolate using a fork, then placed on wax paper to harden. A sprinkle of toasted coconut or a delicate chocolate drizzle often finished each piece, giving every batch a festive homemade appearance. The first bite revealed a crisp chocolate shell that quickly gave way to a soft, chewy coconut center bursting with creamy sweetness. The coconut added a delicate tropical flavor, while the chocolate coating balanced every bite with rich cocoa notes. Hidden almonds or cherries created an extra layer of texture and flavor that made these candies even more memorable. As factory-made chocolate boxes became more affordable and convenient, fewer families continued making coconut bonbons from scratch. Holiday traditions gradually shifted toward store-bought sweets, and these handcrafted candies quietly disappeared from many American kitchens. Today, coconut bonbons remain a delicious reminder of a time when homemade candy reflected patience, generosity, and creativity. Every bite recalls festive family gatherings, treasured recipe cards, and the simple joy of sharing handmade sweets with the people who mattered most. Penuche, brown sugar fudge. Long before rich chocolate fudge dominated holiday candy trays, penuche was one of America's most beloved homemade sweets. Featured in Betty Crocker cookbooks and family recipe collections throughout the 1950s and 1960s, this creamy brown sugar fudge became a favorite because of its deep caramel flavor and smooth texture. Unlike traditional chocolate fudge, penuche relied on brown sugar, butter, and fresh cream, creating a candy that felt both comforting and wonderfully old-fashioned. It was especially popular during Christmas, when families filled decorative tins with handmade treats to share with friends and neighbors. Making penuche required careful attention and patience. Brown sugar, butter, cream, and a pinch of salt were slowly cooked together until the mixture reached the perfect softball stage. After cooling slightly, pure vanilla was added before the mixture was beaten vigorously with a wooden spoon. As air was worked into the candy, it gradually thickened into a smooth, creamy fudge with a light caramel color. Chopped pecans or walnuts were often folded in before the mixture was spread into a buttered pan and left to cool. Once firm, it was cut into neat squares, each one carrying the unmistakable aroma of buttery brown sugar. The first bite melted almost instantly, releasing rich flavors of caramel, butter, and vanilla with a subtle nutty crunch. Its creamy texture made it softer than many traditional fudges, while the brown sugar added a warm, toasted sweetness that lingered pleasantly after every bite. It was simple, comforting, and impossible to forget. As chocolate candies became increasingly popular and factory-made desserts filled grocery stores, penuche slowly disappeared from many American kitchens. Yet for those who remember its rich caramel flavor, this forgotten fudge remains a sweet reminder that some of the finest homemade candies never needed chocolate to become unforgettable. Chocolate walnut fudge. Long before supermarket shelves overflowed with boxed chocolates, homemade chocolate walnut fudge was one of the most treasured candies in American kitchens. Betty Crocker cookbooks helped make this rich confection a holiday tradition throughout the 1950s and 1960s, when families proudly displayed neat squares of fudge on Christmas dessert trays and packed them into festive tins as heartfelt gifts. It wasn't just a candy, it was a symbol of generosity, celebration, and the joy of making something special with your own hands. Preparing chocolate walnut fudge demanded patience and precision. Butter, sugar, milk, and unsweetened chocolate were slowly cooked together while being stirred constantly to prevent scorching. Once the mixture reached the perfect softball stage, it was removed from the heat and allowed to cool slightly before pure vanilla was added. Then came the most important step. Home cooks beat the mixture with a sturdy wooden spoon until it thickened into a smooth, velvety fudge. Finally, generous handfuls of chopped walnuts were folded in, adding a satisfying crunch before the fudge was poured into a buttered pan to cool. After setting, it was sliced into perfectly sized squares, each one rich with chocolate and toasted nuts. The first bite was unforgettable. The creamy chocolate melted slowly across the tongue while the walnuts added a delicate crunch and a warm, nutty flavor. Unlike many modern fudges made with artificial ingredients, homemade chocolate walnut fudge tasted deeply rich, buttery, and perfectly balanced, making it impossible to stop at just one piece. As boxed candy and commercial chocolates became more convenient, fewer families continued the tradition of making fudge from scratch. The treasured recipe slowly disappeared from many kitchens, replaced by store-bought sweets that rarely matched its homemade flavor. Today, chocolate walnut fudge remains a delicious reminder of an era when America's sweetest memories were handcrafted one pan, one wooden spoon, and one family recipe at a time. Peanut brittle. Long before candy bars and chocolate treats dominated store shelves, homemade peanut brittle was one of America's most treasured old-fashioned candies. Betty Crocker cookbooks and family recipe collections helped make this crisp confection a household favorite throughout the 1950s and 1960s. It appeared on holiday dessert tables, county fair displays, church bake sales, and Christmas gift tins because it was affordable, easy to share, and stayed fresh for weeks. For many families, making peanut brittle marked the official beginning of the holiday season. The recipe demanded careful timing and steady attention. Sugar, light corn syrup, water, and butter were slowly heated until they reached the hard crack stage. Roasted peanuts were stirred into the bubbling syrup, followed by vanilla and a spoonful of baking soda at the very last moment. Almost instantly, the mixture became lighter and slightly foamy, creating the candy's signature crisp texture. It was quickly poured onto a buttered baking sheet and spread into a thin layer before cooling into a beautiful sheet of golden brittle. Once hardened, it was broken by hand into jagged, rustic pieces, making every batch unique. The first bite delivered a satisfying snap that echoed through the kitchen. Rich buttery caramel surrounded perfectly roasted peanuts, creating a balance of sweetness and nuttiness that kept people reaching for another piece. Unlike many modern peanut candies, homemade peanut brittle offered a delicate crunch that melted into warm caramel flavors without feeling overly sticky or heavy. As packaged snacks and factory-made candies became cheaper and more convenient, fewer families continued making peanut brittle from scratch. The candy thermometer, once an essential kitchen tool, slowly disappeared from many homes, taking this cherished tradition with it. Today, peanut brittle remains a delicious symbol of America's homemade candy-making heritage, reminding us that some of the most unforgettable sweets were created with simple ingredients, patient hands, and recipes lovingly passed from one generation to the next. Divinity with pecans. Long before chocolate bars and colorful candy aisles became an everyday sight, one homemade sweet stood above the rest on America's holiday tables. It was called Divinity, a delicate white candy so light and airy that many believed it practically melted the moment it touched your tongue. Betty Crocker cookbooks helped make Divinity with pecans one of the most celebrated homemade candies throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Preparing it was considered a true test of a home cook's skill, and a successful batch was often worn as a badge of honor during Christmas gatherings, church socials, and family celebrations. Making Divinity required perfect timing and even a little cooperation from the weather. Sugar, light corn syrup, and water were boiled to the exact hardball stage before the hot syrup was slowly poured into stiffly beaten egg whites. Then came the hard work. The mixture had to be beaten continuously until it became thick, glossy, and fluffy enough to hold its shape. Only then were chopped pecans and a splash of vanilla gently folded in. Working quickly, spoonfuls were dropped onto sheets of wax paper, where each piece cooled into soft white mounds with toasted pecans peeking through the surface. The first bite explained why this candy earned its heavenly name. The delicate shell gave way to a light, cloud-like center that dissolved almost instantly, releasing sweet vanilla flavors and the buttery crunch of roasted pecans. Unlike dense modern candies, Divinity felt impossibly light while still delivering rich homemade flavor. As convenience foods and factory-made chocolates became the new standard, fewer families had the patience to master this delicate recipe. Today, Divinity with pecans survives mostly in treasured family cookbooks and fading recipe cards, serving as a sweet reminder of an era when America's finest holiday candies were crafted with patience, tradition, and a little bit of kitchen magic. That brings us to the end of our journey through 30 forgotten Betty Crocker candies that once made America's kitchens sweeter, warmer, and filled with unforgettable memories. These weren't just homemade treats, they were family traditions passed from one generation to the next, created with simple ingredients, patience, and plenty of love. We'd love to know which of these classic candies you remember or wish you could taste today. Share your favorite in the comments below. And if you enjoyed rediscovering these nostalgic recipes, be sure to like this video, subscribe to America's Lost Recipes, and join us next time as we uncover more delicious treasures from America's forgotten culinary past.